Well, don't expect 73 nothing every week, but that must have been fun after 7 losses last year to just completely, in Oklahoma fashion of years gone by, just annihilate somebody and put up crazy numbers on the scoreboard. So SMU is up next, should provide a little more resistance, or maybe quite a bit more resistance as the Sooners get ready for Big 12 play in a few weeks. Sooners live right here at the Voice of College Football. Appreciate you all being here. Got Jason Ray here to break down Oklahoma football. You can join him after each and every Sooners game right here on the SG1 channel. We also would invite you to subscribe to our Big 12 channel, and we've got an SEC channel. So if you go in the description section, you can find the SEC and the Big 12 channels, and I'll provide them in the chat here as well. Jason, how you doing today?
Doing great, Mark. Thanks for having me. It's always week one is you have all the overreaction from week one, so it's really interesting to kind of talk about everything that happened, and so great to be rocking and rolling again.
And probably from a fan base that has been accustomed to, and it's been justified mostly, to overreact in a negative way for the last year and a half. Now maybe overreact on the other side after 73 nothing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think there's a lot of Oklahoma fans and people that have followed this team over particularly last year, that are, I think, cautiously optimistic after week one is kind of the way, the mode, because I think there's understanding that wasn't a very good football team that Oklahoma played on Saturday, to put it lightly. And so, to your point, the competition does go up. But I think at the same time, they played a couple of teams in the non-conference last year that weren't great. Kent State being one, where they were down 3-0 until close to halftime in that game. UTEP was another game where they won. They won that game, and it wasn't close, but it was certainly not anywhere near the margin that Oklahoma had on Saturday. So I think there's reason for optimism. It looked different, but I think it'll be interesting to see how they carry that over to next week. And what I always try to get from these week one games, Mark, is specifically when teams play. Is Oklahoma that good, or is Arkansas State just that bad? I think there's probably a little bit of a combination of both, but I think we'll get a clearer picture on a lot of teams, not just Oklahoma, but a lot of teams as you go into week two.
Absolutely. That's the determination that we all try to make when there's no other games to go by, that, okay, 73 nothing, or if it would have been a struggle, but it's still a comfortable win, but kind of a struggle, kind of an ugly 31-14. Okay, Arkansas State's supposed to be really bad. What does this tell us? And we're not going to know until we get weeks and weeks and weeks of results. However, I would think Arkansas State is probably not going to lose another game 73 nothing. This is about as badly as you can beat a team. So that's a good thing. Was there any position unit, particular player, scheme, or anything involved that you thought, okay, that's really functioning well, beyond everything functioned well, but just anything that stood out to you?
I think for me, the biggest and one of the biggest concerns for this team coming into this year, particularly on the offensive side of the ball, was the wide receiver core. And I think I was very, again, this is game one against a team that they'll play better defensive teams, obviously, through the year. But the wide receiver core was much better, really, than I anticipated in myself, and just the way they, just how physical they were in going up and getting the ball, how physical they were in terms of being able to block downfield. And so, in just a lot of kids, made contributions, right? Even the guy that Oklahoma felt like coming into this is probably the most solidified was Jalil Farouk, and he didn't even have a catch. I think he had one carry on an end around and missed a near touchdown early in the game. But, Yeah, you saw the speed of Andrew Anthony that would be able to kind of stretch the field for Oklahoma. Drake Stoops probably he could have had, if he wouldn't have got injured, he probably would have had a career day. I think he had 6 catches in a quarter and a half. And then you saw some of the youngsters. Jaden Gibson made a couple of really nice catches, one touchdown catch where he just went up and got the ball. The knock on him over the first, kind of, I say year and a half last year and through the first spring and fall was that, you know, great body, looks the part, but was having trouble kind of catching ball. And so I think that's a welcome sign. Later in the game, Nick Anderson had a couple of really nice catches, one on a long ball. And so I think that was very encouraging for me looking at this wide receiver core that I feel like they've probably got 6 to 8 kids that they feel comfortable in playing now. Once you get into conference season, it'll be interesting to see if they kind of still go 8 deep like they did on Saturday. But you feel very comfortable and confident with what they had. And I think the other thing, it's something that a lot of us probably knew coming in, but you would like to see it against an opponent. But Oklahoma is such it's night and day the better shape that they are at the backup quarterback position right now than what they were a year ago. Again, you consider the opponent, but Jackson Arnold was 11 for 11, had a touchdown pass, had a touchdown run for Oklahoma in that game. And I think the thing that you look for, Mark, when you start getting some of the second and third teamers in there, is are they able to execute the offense? Are they able to run the offense in the same manner in which they did previously? And so Jackson Arnold played all of the second half until like the last series or two, and they scored 28 points while he was in the game. So I think you feel very, very comfortable where Oklahoma is should something happen to Dillon Gabriel in that area. I said the other thing on the defensive side of the ball that I would point to is I think the tackling was much, much better. I read where or I saw where they had only three missed tackles in a game in the game this past Saturday against Arkansas State. I think the lowest missed tackles they had last year was 9 in a game. So that's positive. And they really were able to play a lot of players, I think, overall. I think they played somewhere in the neighborhood of 87 players in that game on Saturday. So you got a lot of experience for some of the younger kids that are, kind of turning over the roster. And, Mark, I think we're beginning to see that with teams like Colorado that had a completely new roster. And, that's really kind of the talk of college football after week 1. Texas State is another one. They had a ton of transfers, and they went in and they beat Baylor. So, I think the conventional wisdom has been over the last few years that, gosh, this team or whatever team, just insert team name here, has a lot of different moving parts, a lot of different players on this team. So it might take them a little bit to get ready. Well, I think there's some teams that are starting to, at least early on in the season, starting to debunk that theory a little bit. But having said that, I think it was nice to get that amount of players some playing time in week 1.
Hey, Jason, it was a talking point of ours throughout the offseason in regards to the running back distribution. Now, anytime you run up a score like this, everyone's going to be able to get into the mix to a certain extent. So the carries are all over the place. Dalen Smothers, the highly prized running back out of North Carolina, got 7 carries in the opener, something I didn't necessarily expect. Marcus Major, who was so impressive in camp, with 9, and Javante Barnes with 13, and all the way down the list. Just a lot of backs got involved or got their hands on the football. But considering the score, does it really mean much? So are you able to in any way project what this distribution is going to look like against a big opponent?
Yeah, I think they've got 4 guys that they really feel comfortable with carrying the ball between. You'd mentioned Marcus Major and Tawi Walker. Both were kind of listed as the co-starters, and Tawi Walker was was the starter for this game. And then Javonte Barnes got in late. Gavin Sawchuk was held out just because of some bumps and bruises, but Venable said that he's cleared. He'll be ready to go. So I think you've got those 4 guys that they feel comfortable with being able to run those guys out there. I think it'll be a situation, Mark, where you kind of run with the hot hand. So I think, to me, it's a little too early to tell to see exactly what that distribution will look like. I think guys like Caleb Hicks and Dalen Smothers that you'd mentioned probably will get some carries in some of these early season games when the score is a little bit out of hand, if they're fortunate enough to have that situation. But those are those top 4 guys. Now, will they continue to kind of divvy carries up between those 4? I doubt it, but I think that you're going to have packages where different situations where you've got guys like Tawee Walker is probably their best short yardage running back. So I think you see him a lot in situations where it's goal to go, or 3rd and short, or 4th and short. Javonte Barnes is kind of in that same mold as well, whereas you've got some of the others like Gavin Sawchuk is more of kind of a home run threat. So I think, all of them bring a little bit different thing to the table. And, when you have a 73-0 score, you have the opportunity to nitpick a few things. I guess the only thing that you would say from a running back perspective is they weren't able to break a long one. There was a lot of long gains, but, Sawchuk is really that guy. So I think that improvement that you continue to look through, throughout the year will be interesting to see how those carries ended up being divvied up between those 4 guys.
And that's where I was going to take that next, because for a 73-0 game, and this is nitpicky, but you would think that there would have been some longer runs than Javonte Barnes 16, Tyree Walker 11, and the others came from the quarterback position and Jaleel Farouk. So only 2 10-plus yard runs out of the running backs, and you would just think that they would have broken something, because 49 rush attempts take away the quarterbacks and wide receivers, and you're probably more in the 35 range, 35 attempts against this team, and they didn't get anything past 16 and only 2 past 10 yards.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Mark. And I think it's I don't know that I would say that it's cause for concern. I think it would be just kind of sit tight and watch this over the next couple of weeks, right? If Oklahoma is not able to and again, they didn't struggle to run the football. I think they ran for over 200 yards. There just wasn't a lot of big chunk plays that you would expect. The big chunk plays that Oklahoma had were in the passing game last week. So, which, that's good in and of itself, right? Because there's certainly some question marks around Dylan Gabriel and some question marks around the receiving core. But yeah, I think that's, like I said, that's something that to kind of keep your eye on as Oklahoma continues certainly through the non-conference season these next couple of weeks.
So now, before we get to SMU, you had mentioned before we came on here live that there are a few injuries of note. You did mention McCullough and Stoops. Are those the 2? Anything else that came out?
There was three real injuries that came across in the game. So Drake Stoops had an AC joint injury. I think it was originally feared that it was a potential kind of a clavicle thing or something like that. But no, it ended up being just a sprained AC joint in the from what Venable said and the crew said after the game, that if it was one of those situations, it was a more tightly contested game, he could have came back in, and he was actually trying to get himself back in. But I think he should be fine. Now, there wasn't any definitive response from Venables in terms of if they would be able to play this week, but I think all signs point to him and Deshaun McCullough being able to come back in. Davis Bevel got hurt late in the game. I think his was more of a high ankle sprain, so he's probably a couple of weeks away from coming back. And certainly as Oklahoma's third team quarterback at this point. So, yeah, I mean, and there's a couple of guys that Oklahoma had held out. I mentioned Gavin Sawchuk that was held out. He should be good to go. R. Mason Thomas, defensive end, was held out of the game against Arkansas State, and he should be good to go this week against SMU. So, yeah, thankfully there was none of those three injuries were major in nature.
Jason Ray's here for Oklahoma Sooners Live and Oklahoma Post Game. Right after the game, check out Jason's work and his interactions with you. Leave your comments and questions today. And also right after the game, OU and SMU. Speaking of which, SMU coming off a 38-14 win over Louisiana Tech, who was a pretty bad football team at 3-9 last year. SMU turned in what is somewhat a typical SMU performance. Chad Morris, Sonny Dykes, now Rhett Lashley. SMU's been one of the better teams in the American Conference, only 7-6, so a bit of a down year last year. They did. One takeaway is that the newcomers to the Big 12, SMU played rather well. They lost to BYU by 1 point in their bowl game, beat Houston in one of the more entertaining, if you like, offense and ridiculous, probably blown coverages and no tackling against Houston, 77-63. I think that's a game in which Tanner Mordecai threw 9 touchdown passes. And then they lost to Cincinnati, a really good Bearcats team under Luke Fickell, 29-27. So really close games. And UCF, well, that was their one game in which they got manhandled 41-19 to a certain extent. But Tanner Mordecai gone. Rhett Lashley in his second season. They're coming off that 24-point win against Louisiana Tech. Preston Stone, 3 touchdown passes. LJ Johnson at the running back spot, 128 yards. So definitely a pretty significant upgrade in class in terms of opponent.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when you think of it from the offensive side of the ball, Mark. I mean, that game was being played at 11 a.m. Central at the same time so I didn't really get a chance to watch much of it. But I watched the replay yesterday, the entire game, and as you mentioned, SMU pretty much controlled things in the first half, up 31-0, and really just kind of didn't show much or didn't really do a whole lot in the second half and winning that game 38-14. Yeah, Louisiana Tech's not a great team. They had to come back to beat FIU in week 1, 22-17, which turned around and just barely beat Maine 14-12 this past week. But when you look at this SMU team, particularly on the offense side of the ball, Preston Stone, which they remarked on the broadcast, was the highest recruited, highest touted recruit that SMU has got since the 80s, which is very interesting. 4-star kid, looked really good. I think the thing that you notice about SMU that really kind of jumps off is their skill position players are really, really solid. When you look at Preston Stone, you'd mentioned LJ Johnson, the transfer from Texas A&M, also Jalen Knighton, the transfer from SMU's another team that is loaded with transfers all across the board. Jalen Knighton from Miami, a name that most Oklahoma fans will remember. Kamar Wheaton is part of that team. He was held out last week because of just kind of a rules violation. He'll be back this week. Jeremy Curley, wide receiver. He's another transfer. RJ Maryland, kind of a tight end type. Again, another transfer. So they're loaded at the skill position. I think they're what they lack in experience at the quarterback position with Preston Stone versus what Tanner Mordecai. I mean, he's got the skill. So again, it's one of those very similar situation that Oklahoma faced with Arkansas State, that SMU played a team that wasn't super talented, but they went out there and they dominated the first half of play. Got a couple of benefits of the doubt on a couple of calls early that made that game a little bit more lopsided than it could have been. But yeah, this will be a significant challenge for Oklahoma's defense, without a doubt. I think when you compare this team to, you kind of want to compare this team to Nebraska last year from a non-conference perspective. I think this is probably a better offensive team. than Nebraska had, at least from a skill position perspective, but probably not quite as good on the defensive side of the ball. And understanding that Oklahoma scored in the 40s last year against Nebraska. So I think, the way looking at this, again, very hard to tell. SMU was pretty good at the point of attack on the defensive side of the ball, had 6 sacks on Louisiana Tech. Quarterback Hank, I'm sorry, the transfer from Boise State. His name was escaping me. Anyways, I'll think of it here in a second. Hank is his first name, I believe. So,
Bauer,
Bachmeister, is that right?
Yes, Bachmeyer.
Bachmeyer, that's right. So, he was. They really didn't have any opportunity to run. I think they only ran the ball for about 28 yards in that game, and so he was under duress. So, again, I think you've got a little bit of a challenge for Oklahoma's offensive line, but the biggest challenge I think will be for Oklahoma defensively, because there are a lot of good skill players. Wasn't super impressed with SMU's offensive line, so I think this will be another game where Oklahoma has an opportunity to get some, to really get some, see exactly how good this defensive line can be, because I think it's much improved. And again, another nitpick area for Oklahoma this past week was the fact that there wasn't a whole lot of pressure on the quarterback. And Arkansas, when you go back and watch the tape, Arkansas State, a lot of max protect situations, not a lot of drop back passing. It was very quick passes, so really didn't get an opportunity to see that. So you'll see a little bit different. These two teams are very similar in the way they attack you on the offensive side of the ball. So it's almost looking at yourself in the mirror, because SMU is going to try to go as fast as they possibly can. A lot of bubbles, a lot of short passes, and things like that. So it's going to be interesting to watch. I think, like I said, I think this is probably, when you look at the first half of the schedule, Mark, I think this is probably the best offensive team that Oklahoma will face, maybe until they play Texas. Now, Cincinnati kind of remains to be seen with what they're going to provide, but this is probably the best offense that Oklahoma will face until Texas. So big, good challenge for them coming in week 2.
Yeah, 15.5 is the point spread. And so that's not anything overwhelming. So Vegas expects it to be somewhat of a competitive game. OU a decided favorite, healthy favorite. But yeah, again, 15.5 is nothing overwhelming. So it should be a fairly competitive game.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and the fan base kind of gets spoiled by a shutout, right? I mean, that's not something that anyone should even remotely be considering this week. So I think, if Oklahoma can hold SMU to, I would say, anywhere from 17 to 24 points, I mean, that's a good sign, because SMU is a team that's probably going to score on most teams that they play this year. I think the one thing, the inexperience at quarterback, I think is the one thing that you might be able to look at in terms of, that could be a situation where, he could be rattled a little bit if things kind of go bad or go awry.
Yeah, again, SMU last year, they scored in the high 20s in those games against what are now Big 12 teams, 3 of them. Well, Houston, 77. But then the other ones, yeah, generally in the high 20s against everybody else. They also had a game last year against Maryland. I remember checking in on this game late when I saw that there was a really good game between Maryland and SMU. So I saw maybe the back half of the fourth quarter, and they had Maryland tied on the road before they gave up a late touchdown to lose to the Terps 34-27. And Maryland was, again, not an elite team by any stretch, but a good team, a top 40 team in the country, 8-5 team, won a bowl game. So yeah, SMU's no joke. So we'll know a lot more about Oklahoma's football team, whether they just narrowly escaped or, God forbid, I know I shouldn't state this on here, they get upset because, again, It's only 15 and a half points, and that happens in college football a couple places almost every week, where a double digit favorite goes down, or if they just again look mighty impressive, and again it's not going to be 73 nothing, but if it's 52-24 and they really just had control of the game, then we'll see where the conversation steers us based on those results on Saturday. But you're moving from what looks like it's probably one of the 10 worst, 15 worst teams in the country to a team that's more like a top 50 team in the country, something in that range.
Yeah, no, I would absolutely agree with that, Mark. I think when you look at SMU, I think they're right there along with Tulane. Maybe one of the best teams in the American, certainly this year. The difference always tends to be with teams like that is if how can they hold up on the line of scrimmage in the trenches on the offensive and defensive lines for the totality of the game, right? I mean, early on, it could be negligible, but as the depth of a stronger team like Oklahoma plays out, what does that look like late in the game? So yeah, no, but you're right, Mark. I think this will go a long way in really kind of identifying what the trajectory of this Oklahoma team can be, right? If Oklahoma limits them to 17 to 24 points, and it's to your point, somewhere in the neighborhood of 52-24, I think that's obviously a really good solid win. Now, if there's a situation where it's like 38-35, 42-38 or something like that, then I think then the PTSD from last year will start kind of rearing its ugly head. But but that's why you challenge yourself to a certain degree in non-conference, right? You want to have these teams that are going to challenge you in such a way that prepares you for what the Big 12 conference is going to look like. Now, I say that, to me, watching the games around the country, and of course, this week in the Big 12, the schedule is going to be tougher. But right now, the Big 12 probably looks like the worst Power 5 conference in the country when you look at what the Pac-12 was able to do, going 13-0 so far, with USC having the only two games, and then the ACC, where I think you go to one extreme on what we saw Sunday night versus what we saw Monday night, right? You saw Florida State, that was incredibly impressive. Game probably, they're not that much better than LSU, but the game kind of got away from LSU late. And then Clemson, again, did not look at all, what we have come accustomed to them over the last 5 or 6 years. So, there was a couple of games for the Big 12 that, they just didn't look good. Oklahoma State was very unimpressive in their game against Central Arkansas. Texas Tech, who was a trendy pick for a lot of people to have a really, really good season and potentially get to the Big 12 championship game, looked great early, but then that's a game you got to win if you're Texas Tech. So it'll be interesting to see how these. And then Texas struggled early on. They looked pretty good in the second half, but then they struggled early on. So I don't know. Once you see some of these, how is the Big 12? The schedule, I think, the perception was the schedule was a little bit weaker for Oklahoma this year. Having said that, maybe it looks even a little bit even more so after one week.
I picked Texas Tech to go to the Big 12 championship game. I picked a 3-way tie between Oklahoma, Texas Tech, and Kansas State. And I actually did that not knowing, I didn't have like a predetermined outcome of who would win the tiebreaker. And then I just went through the tiebreaker and it came out Texas Tech. So I'm going to take some partial credit if it turns out to be Kansas State or Oklahoma in the Big 12 championship game. But I only bring that up because I took some shots at some predictions that, if you go by the chalk and Texas Tech loses an out of conference game, well, then that would have been the Oregon game coming up this week and not against Wyoming. But I actually picked them to lose to Wyoming and beat Oregon.
Oh.
Now that they've lost to Wyoming, I don't know that I'm that confident that they're going to beat Oregon, though. But they are just a 6.5 point favorite. They're at home, and teams, and you know this, Jason, and I think it even holds truer in the NFL where everybody's bunched together from a talent perspective and a projection standpoint. And there's a zillion 3 point games in the fourth quarter in the NFL, mid afternoon on every Sunday. But there's the biggest overreaction to betting lines in week 2 because
Yep.
everybody saw the games in week 1 and they just think that's what these teams are. And that's not the case. That's one data point that gives us a little indication, but that teams will change drastically in week 2, week 3, and then maybe by week 8, 9, 10, we'll have a pretty good barometer on just about everyone. But these first few weeks, there's going to be wild swings where, oh, we thought this team was a world beater in week 1. Well, they came back down to earth. Somebody put them in their place, or vice versa. We thought they were horrible. No, they're really not that horrible. But yeah, not a good week for the Big 12. You mentioned Oklahoma State's performance. BYU's performance was not the best.
Mm-hmm.
Texas State beat Baylor, and Texas Tech, of course, loses to what's usually a pretty marginal Wyoming team.
Yeah.
Now they come back and play Oregon. Huge week for the conference. Texas plays Alabama, Texas Tech, Oregon. Oklahoma State's got a Power 5 team in Arizona State, even though they don't look to be too good. And I'm sure there's a few other ones out there that I was just about to pull up the schedule. But yeah, the Big 12 lost 4 games in week 1, which is a pretty heavy number. Kansas has an interest. This is one that I'm intrigued to see. Kansas hosting Illinois on Friday night.
Yeah, Mark, as you mentioned, I mean, there's it's up and down the conference. I mean, there's really solid tests for all of these, almost every one of these teams. Utah and Baylor, Kansas State hosts Troy. Troy's not a great team, but certainly formidable. Iowa State. Cincinnati goes to Pittsburgh. You'd mentioned Oregon and Texas Tech. UCF goes to Boise. And then, as you mentioned, Oklahoma State and Arizona State. So I think it's a good opportunity, just from exactly what you said, not to completely react, but just see what this looks like in week 2, right? I mean, I think when you, particularly your point about the betting lines, yeah, I mean, everybody, it's so difficult in week 1, in week 2, because, I mean, just take Oregon and Texas Tech for an example. Oregon scored 81 points against, I think, Portland State. I mean, it's an FCS team for sure, but they score 81 points and they look phenomenal in all areas of the game. And then Texas Tech is coming off of that disappointing loss in week 1. So, how could Texas Tech possibly win this game? Well, this is why they play the games. So, yeah, it'll be very, very, very interesting to see what this looks like, and probably the best week for the Big 12 overall, just to kind of make a little bit of a I don't know, not really kind of reclaiming their glory or so to speak, but really just kind of was it just 1 week of a struggle? Because you've got a lot of teams, Mark. I think it was very interesting nationally. I mean, there's a lot of teams that struggled that we're not used to seeing struggle, right? Like Clemson is a perfect example, scoring 7 points, on Monday night against Duke. Ohio State was really, obviously you look at that and you say, if I didn't realize CJ Stroud was that good, like, yes, he's that good. And it was expected, I think, right? I mean, I don't think most people thought with a brand new quarterback coming in that they were just going to light things up. And Michigan looked a little pedestrian early on. And so I think it's just going to be such an interesting season, Mark, to watch some of these teams, especially some of the teams that are breaking in new quarterbacks, right? I mean, Alabama looked good, but again, it was Middle Tennessee, so it's a different situation. So it's so interesting. Georgia was the same way, very much like Ohio State. Did not look great early on. Of course, they poured it on a little bit later, but I think that game was like 7-0 towards the end of the first half. So it'll be interesting to see when there's a little bit more competition, how some of these teams that are, breaking in new quarterbacks and things like that, how that works.
Whether you're a believer in Vegas or not, you have to understand that there's some credibility in the point spreads because they are pretty good at what they do. And if there's a point spread that's way off, it's usually because we were all way off. So they didn't just miss it. We all missed it and didn't see it coming. And Jason referenced 2 games. Texas Tech was a 14-point favorite against Wyoming, and Clemson was a 13-point favorite against Duke. They both lost. Oklahoma, 15.5-point pick against SMU. So again, for those of us, and I'll include myself to a certain extent, that slept on this non-conference schedule, this may be the one that's a little bit interesting. I'm not expecting any kind of nail biter, but if Vegas is on this game, then it's probably still a game through 3 quarters. It's probably 1 to 2 scores, and then Oklahoma's going to break away at some point and win 40-27 or 41-27 or something like that. If Vegas is right on it, then it's going to be something in that range. All right, everyone. Appreciate you being here at Sooners Live. We get together with Jason each and every week, typically Wednesday at 12:30 Eastern, but we've got schedules to coordinate. So we would ask that you would subscribe and just make sure that you hit the bell for the notifications. Also, keep in mind that we've got a Big 12 channel. So this is perfect, Sooners fans. Big 12 channel we just launched and an SEC channel that we just launched. So, I'm roping you into subscribing to both for obvious reasons. You need to be there for the Big 12 channel now and the SEC channel in the future. So please subscribe. And for whatever reason, if you don't care, but you enjoy what we do overall here at the Voice of College Football, understand that it's all connected. So you help us with the content that you want to see by helping us with the content that you don't want to see, if that makes sense. So sub up to the channels and you help us grow and build and continue. All right, Jason, was there anything else you wanted to hit on?
No, I don't think so. I just think it's just so, week 1 is, it's there for observation, not for overreaction, right? I mean, and I think week 2 will certainly provide a lot of clarity for, certainly Oklahoma, but other teams as well. As we've mentioned this a lot through the preseason, I think this is a perfect schedule situation for Oklahoma in these first 2, even the non-conference leading up to Texas, is the fact that you have obviously with Arkansas State, but looking back even before then, this is a game that you felt comfortable was a good situation for you to get some young kids involved, and then SMU is a tougher test, particularly for your new and improved and revamped defense. And then you go to Tulsa next week, which is, you get the road game kind of situation under control. So, yeah, I think this is a good situation for Oklahoma, and we'll see how they respond here in the second week.
All right, Jason, we appreciate you doing this. We'll be back next week with the wrap-up on SMU, and I look forward to Tulsa. And, of course, Jason's going to be here right after the ball game against the SMU Mustangs. All right, Jason, appreciate you making this happen.
All right. Thanks for having me, Mark.